Hello. Today we'll dive into an intriguing story about how one reckless choice can lead to unpredictable consequences. At a barbecue, she meets her old friend, Clark, and there's an instant spark between them. This marks the beginning of an emotional conflict that involves not only her feelings, but also her relationship with her husband, Daniel. But before you get comfortable, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's really interesting to see who's joined us. Now get comfortable. We're starting. The evening had that gentle warmth only early summer could bring. In the backyard of Rachel and Thomas's house, fairy lights hung from the branches, flickering like lazy fireflies. The smell of grilled vegetables and marinated meat wafted through the air. Laughter rose above the soft music playing from a wireless speaker perched on a wooden table next to half-empty wine bottles and melting ice. Hannah stood near the edge of the patio, her glass of white wine sweating in her hand. She wore a simple green dress that hugged her hips just enough to catch an eye. Though it wasn't her intention, or maybe lately it had become her intention, even if she wouldn't admit it to herself. She watched Daniel, her husband, from across the yard. He was talking to Thomas and two other men she didn't know well. His hand gestures were animated, his voice light and sure. He looked comfortable, handsome even, but something about the sight of him didn't move her anymore. "Hey, you've been standing here like a statue." Rachel's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned, smiling. "I'm just enjoying the air," Hannah said. Rachel looked at her knowingly. "Or the view," she teased, glancing over Hannah's shoulder. Hannah followed the glance and saw him, Clark, their old friend, now divorced, recently moved back to the area. He was leaning against the fence, holding a beer, wearing jeans and a dark button-up shirt rolled at the sleeves. His forearms were tanned and strong. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular. Until he did. Right at her. She felt her pulse flicker. It wasn't the first time lately. He had smiled at her earlier when she arrived. A little too long. He had touched her waist when greeting her, slightly lower than was polite. She hadn't pulled away. Rachel tilted her head. "You know he's been watching you all evening." "Clark?" Hannah tried to sound amused. "Please?" "I'm serious." If Daniel had even half that intensity in his eyes. Rachel let the sentence drift, sipping her wine. Hannah chuckled, trying to hide the heat in her chest. "It's nothing." It wasn't, but it also was. That was the danger. Later, after dinner, when the group settled into looser conversation and cliques had formed, Clark approached. Hannah was sitting on the wooden stairs leading down from the deck, legs crossed, sandals dangling from her fingers. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, nodding to the space beside her. "It's your house too, technically," she replied. He smiled and took the spot, their knees nearly brushing. "You seem distant," he said after a pause. "I guess I've been in my head." "Want to talk about it?" She looked at him, studying the lines at the corners of his eyes, the slow confidence in his expression. There was a difference in how he looked at her. Not just as a friend's wife, something more charged. "Not sure that's a good idea," she whispered. He leaned a little closer. "Why not?" "Because talking leads to thinking, and thinking leads to things I shouldn't be thinking." Clark said nothing for a moment, but his hand moved. just barely to brush hers. She didn't pull away. The moment passed quickly. Rachel called her name from the patio. Hannah pulled her hand back as if waking from a trance. She stood, brushing her dress, and offered a quick smile. "I should help clean up." Clark nodded. "Right." As she walked away, she didn't dare look back. But she felt his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, she liked being seen. The office was quieter than usual. The hum of the air conditioning was steady. A soft breath against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the studio. Hannah sat at her desk, flipping through pages of blueprint revisions. Her fingers moved automatically, but her thoughts were far from technical. Clark's touch, the memory had embedded itself like a shadow on her skin. Soft, fleeting, and far too welcome. She had spent most of the weekend reliving it in fragments, angry at herself and yet secretly waiting for more. She pushed the thoughts away and stood. She needed coffee. Something hot, bitter, real. As she walked to the break room, she passed Sienna, the front desk assistant who gave her a brief nod, earbuds in. The place felt dreamlike, filtered through a haze of morning fatigue and restless desire. Inside the kitchen stood Sam. "Hey," he said, his back to her as he poured coffee into a paper cup. His sleeves were rolled up, forearms lean but defined, his shirt tucked in neatly. He was always neat, always quiet, but there was something in the way he watched her. Careful, deliberate. "Morning," she replied, opening a cabinet for a mug. "You seem off today," he added, handing her the sugar. She looked at him sharply. "Do I?" "Not in a bad way," he said quickly. "Just distracted." "I've had a lot on my mind," she admitted. "Personal stuff." "Sometimes the best way to deal with personal stuff is to focus on something else," Sam said, sipping his drink. Hannah smiled faintly. "That's your strategy?" He shrugged. "It works, most days." Their eyes met. There was something quiet but charged in that moment. Not overtly sexual, but intimate, as if a private room had briefly opened between them. She broke the gaze first. "Well," she said, lifting her mug, "here's to distracting ourselves." Sam nodded. "To better thoughts." Later that afternoon, Grace, her supervisor, called her in for a client preview. Hannah gathered her notes and entered the meeting room to find not just Grace and the client, but also Mark, the intern. He was seated on the far side of the long table, pen spinning between his fingers, eyes already on her as she stepped in. Mark was young, not much older than 25, and handsome in that slightly arrogant way that often came with youth and awareness of good genes. The presentation began. Hannah did her part smoothly, but every time she looked up, Mark was watching her. Not rudely, not flirtatiously, just watching. Like someone who had guessed a secret and was waiting to be proven right. After the meeting, as they exited the room, he fell into step beside her. "You've got this way of talking that makes concrete sound intimate," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "That's supposed to be a compliment?" He grinned. "Absolutely. You make design sound like seduction." She stopped in her tracks. "Careful." "Why? You think I don't mean it?" "I think you're too used to saying things and not caring about the outcome." Mark looked at her. really looked. Maybe I am. Or maybe I just say what others are too polite to admit. She left him standing there, heart thudding harder than she wanted to admit. That night, at home, Daniel was late again. Hannah sat curled on the couch, glass of wine untouched on the coffee table. The TV playing some half-watched drama she couldn't focus on. Her phone buzzed. A message. It was Clark. Couldn't stop thinking about your eyes. You looked like you wanted to scream that night. She stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. She typed. Deleted. Typed again. I didn't, not really. His reply was almost instant. Then why didn't you stop me? She set the phone down, chest rising with shallow breath. Because she hadn't wanted to. Because no one else had made her feel like she was still capable of being desired. Of being more than just a wife holding a life together out of duty. A minute passed. Another message lit up the screen. Say the word and I'll come over. No questions. No promises. Just honesty. Hannah stood and walked to the bathroom. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her face was softer now. The lines near her mouth deeper than in college. But her eyes, yes, there was something wild in them. She did not reply that night. But she didn't delete the message either. The rented conference hall was draped in neutral tones and faint echoes. Beige walls, dark carpet, overhead lights, humming like nervous thoughts. Hannah stood near the refreshment table, pretending to study the fruit platter, while Clark chatted with another attendee near the coffee station. He looked sharp in his navy suit, no tie, top button open, too casual for the occasion, and yet it worked. It always worked on him. The conference itself was forgettable. A one-day industry event about sustainable architecture, attended mostly by local firms. Grace had asked Hannah to represent the studio. Clark was here as a consultant for a smaller firm. Coincidence, or maybe not. She didn't ask. It had been 3 days since his last message. She hadn't responded, but neither had she told him to stop. They had spoken briefly this morning, like colleagues. Polite, dry, proper. But the way his eyes paused on her mouth when she smiled told a different story. By noon, the sessions dragged. During a break, she slipped outside, letting the door close behind her with a soft click. The air was cool for late spring, and the parking lot shimmered under a pale sun. She leaned against the brick wall, arms folded, breathing deeper than necessary. Footsteps. She didn't turn. She already knew it was him. Do you always run away during panels? Clark's voice was amused. I needed air. Or space. He stood beside her, close enough for the heat of him to brush her skin. They didn't speak for a long moment. You didn't answer my message, he said at last. I didn't need to. Clark turned his head. That's not a no. Do you want me to say no? She whispered, not looking at him. No, he said. I want you to say yes, but I'm not pushing. She turned toward him slowly. His face was just inches from hers. Eyes clear, steady, hands in his pockets like he was trying to behave. I'm married, she said. I know. I'm not unhappy. That part came out quieter, less sure. He leaned closer, not touching. Then why are we out here? Why do you keep showing up in my thoughts when I'm lying alone at night? She stared at him, caught in that delicate, perilous silence. She should have walked away. Instead, she reached up, not touching his face, not quite, and said, "Because you make me feel seen." And then he kissed her. Soft, no push, just lips brushing lips. Once, then again, slower. Her hands remained at her sides, but her mouth opened, just slightly. Her breath caught between want and guilt. He stopped first. They stood there, chests nearly touching, breath shallow. "No regrets?" he asked. "Too soon to tell." They parted before anyone could see. She returned to the conference, cheeks still warm, heart pounding with something dangerously close to delight. Back inside, everything felt louder. Her skin tingled. Her thoughts looped. Every time she tried to focus, her mind pulled her back to the kiss. The feel of his mouth, the quiet hunger in the way he stopped. She had kissed someone else. On purpose. Not drunkenly. Not by accident. She had chosen it, and worse. She wanted more. The drive back home was quiet. She watched the landscape pass. The low hills, the long roads, the sleepy rhythm of suburban life. When she pulled into the driveway, Daniel's car was already there. A reminder. A reality. Inside, he was sitting at the kitchen table, typing on his laptop. He looked up, smiling faintly. "How was the conference?" "Dry," she said, setting her bag down. "Useful, but nothing new." He nodded. "Dinner's almost ready. I made pasta." She blinked. He rarely cooked. "What's the occasion?" He shrugged. "Felt like doing something nice." Guilt hit her like a fist. She kissed another man, while her husband cooked dinner. That night, they ate by candlelight, talked about ordinary things. She almost felt normal again. Almost. When he reached for her under the table, sliding his hand over her thigh, her breath caught, but not from pleasure. Her body stiffened, her muscles unsure. She smiled to cover it. Later, in bed, she let him touch her, let him kiss her neck, murmur into her hair. He tried to be tender. She tried to respond. But her thoughts were full of Clark. His mouth, his patience, his restraint. When Daniel came, she held him close, eyes closed. Not faking, just elsewhere. Afterward, lying in the dark, she stared at the ceiling and whispered to herself, "What am I doing?" But the answer didn't come. The office was buzzing with the usual noise of conversations, ringing phones and clacking keyboards. It had been a week since the conference. A week since her last moment with Clark. He hadn't reached out again. She had half expected him to. Maybe for an afterthought or a reminder. But he hadn't. And that silence, that absence, gnawed at her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The thrill of the kiss still lingered in her chest, like an ember waiting to flare back to life. Hannah sat at her desk, pretending to read through client requests, but her mind was elsewhere. Somewhere between the subtle tension in the back of her mind and the quiet ache in her body. Something had shifted, irrevocably. She couldn't pretend she was just a wife anymore. Or just an employee. She wasn't even sure who she was anymore. A soft knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. "Can I come in?" It was Sam. He stood in the doorway, his usual composed demeanor slightly softer than usual. He looked at her with something that bordered on concern, like he knew she was unraveling, even if she didn't want to admit it. "Sure," she said, straightening her papers. "What's up?" "Just thought we could go over the design revisions. Grace mentioned you might need a second pair of eyes." "Right," she said, looking up and offering a faint smile. "Thanks." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. They began to sift through the work, but the silence between them felt charged. Sam didn't speak much during their meetings. He was efficient, always quiet, but today it felt different. The quiet between them held a weight, a subtle tension that seemed to hum in the air. Half an hour later, Sam's eyes flicked up from the documents and caught hers. He didn't look away this time. He held her gaze for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. It was as if he was waiting for her to say something. She didn't know what to say. She only knew she couldn't escape the feelings that clung to her like a second skin. "Hannah," he said, his voice low. "Is everything okay, Her throat tightened. She had to swallow before she could respond. "I'm fine," she said, but the lie sat heavy on her tongue. Sam didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on her face. "Are you sure? I know we haven't known each other long, but you don't seem like yourself." She shook her head, trying to laugh it off. "I'm just stressed with work, that's all." But he didn't seem convinced. There was a brief moment of silence before he spoke again. Voice soft, deliberate. "You know, if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." The words lingered between them, heavy and loaded with implication. Something passed through her chest. Something dark and unspoken. She could have dismissed it. She could have turned it down, kept it at arm's length. But the truth was, she didn't want to. She wanted someone to see her, to recognize the longing in her that she kept hidden. She swallowed again, feeling the heat creep into her skin. "Thank you, Sam," she said quietly. "I appreciate that." A flicker of something in his eyes, something unreadable, made her stomach tighten. Sam didn't say anything else. He just nodded and returned to the papers. But she could feel the air between them change. A crack in the foundation, something new and uncharted. Later that evening, after work, Hannah found herself standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom, adjusting her makeup. She stared at her reflection, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. Her lips were too full, too red. Her eyes too dark, too heavy. A knock on the bathroom door made her startle. "Hannah?" It was Daniel's voice. "Dinner's ready." She closed her eyes for a moment. She had promised herself that tonight would be different. She would stay grounded. She would focus on her marriage, on the life they had built together. No more distractions, no more fantasies. "Coming," she called, forcing a smile as she wiped the mirror clean. When she entered the kitchen, Daniel was placing 2 plates of pasta on the table. His back was turned, his focus on the task. She watched him for a moment, taking in the quiet rhythm of his movements. She had seen him do this hundreds of times before, and yet tonight it felt unfamiliar. The distance between them had widened to a point where she could feel it in every corner of the room. "Smells good," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "Glad you think so," Daniel replied, sitting down. "You've been quiet tonight. Everything okay?" Just tired," she said, offering a soft smile as she sat down across from him. Daniel looked at her for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Then he shrugged and picked up his fork. They ate in silence. Every bite felt heavy. The distance between them was like a physical wall she couldn't climb over, no matter how hard she tried. And then, as if the universe was mocking her phone buzzed. She glanced at it. A message from Clark. "I miss you. Can't stop thinking about our kiss. Want to see you tonight?" Her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers hovered over the screen, torn. She could feel the weight of her decision pressing against her chest. She could ignore it. She could pretend to be the woman she was supposed to be. But all she had to do was hit reply. Daniel looked up, sensing the shift. "Who's that?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was an edge to it. Something in his tone, something in the air between them, felt wrong. She stopped, heart pounding. She had never lied to him like this before, but in that moment, she realized that lying had already become a habit, a skill she had learned to master. "It's nothing," she said, slipping the phone back into her pocket. "Just a work thing." Daniel nodded, but she saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the kind of doubt that he had tried to ignore for too long. That night, as they lay in bed, his arm around her waist, Hannah couldn't stop thinking about Clark's message, and more importantly, about how much she wanted to respond. She closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. The next day, as she sat at her desk, the phone buzzed again. "I'll be free at 7. You know where to find me?" Hannah's heart raced. She had already crossed a line. She knew that. But did she want to stop? She didn't think so. Hannah's fingers hovered over her phone. She stared at the message from Clark, her heart thudding louder with each passing second. She could already feel the pull, the magnetic draw toward him, the desire, the need. She had already made her choice. The moment she kissed him, the moment she let herself imagine what it would be like to give in fully, she had already decided. Yet there was still a hesitation, a flicker of doubt that danced on the edge of her thoughts. Her phone buzzed again, another message from Clark. "I'm waiting. Don't make me wait too long." Hannah squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the heat that surged through her body. The tension in her chest threatened to consume her. The image of Clark's face, the fire in his eyes when they kissed, flashed in her mind. The choice had already been made. She just needed to accept it. She took a deep breath and typed back a single word. "Okay." The decision was final. She felt the weight of it, the electric buzz of inevitability. She had crossed a line that she couldn't uncross. The consequences would follow, but in that moment, she didn't care. All she cared about was the anticipation, the pull of something raw and uncharted. That evening, the air was thick with the promise of something forbidden. The streetlights outside cast long shadows across the living room, and the silence in the house felt louder than ever before. Daniel was still at work, and the thought of him returning home to find her gone, to find her in the middle of something so reckless, sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't bother changing. The dress she had worn to work still clung to her body, tight enough to outline every curve. She didn't want to waste time. She wanted to get to him. She glanced at her reflection in the hallway mirror. Her hair was still perfectly styled, but her eyes told a different story. The tension in her chest, the heat in her stomach, was evident in the way her pupils dilated, the way her breath quickened. There was a storm inside her, one she couldn't stop. She was no longer the woman who had kissed Daniel goodbye this morning. She was someone else now. Someone who was about to give in to the temptation she had been fighting for weeks. A quick glance at the clock told her it was nearly 7. She grabbed her keys and headed for the door, taking one last look at the house that had once felt like home. When Hannah arrived at Clark's apartment, her pulse was pounding in her ears. She stood outside the door for a moment, hesitating, but then his voice cut through the silence. "Come in." The door swung open before she could knock. He stood there, framed in the doorway, looking like he belonged in the space. Confident, relaxed. The same easy smile on his lips that had made her knees weak the first time they met. He stepped aside to let her in, and she walked past him, unable to shake the feeling that she was about to do something irreversible. Clark closed the door behind her, locking it with a soft click. The sound felt final. The tension in the air thickened, and it was as if the whole world had shrunk to just the two of them. No distractions, no pretenses. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice low and full of promise. Hannah didn't answer. She didn't have to. She could already feel the heat between them, a pull that was undeniable. He took a step toward her, his eyes dark and intense, and she felt her breath catch. She tried to stay composed, but it was impossible. She wanted him, wanted the tension to break, wanted to feel him against her, to feel alive in a way she hadn't in so long. Clark reached out and gently cupped her face, tilting her chin up so that their eyes met. For a moment, he just stared at her, as if memorizing the way she looked. The slight flush in her cheeks, the way her lips parted ever so slightly in anticipation. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his thumb brushing over her bottom lip. The words sent a shiver through her, and she leaned into his touch instinctively. His hand moved to the back of her neck, pulling her closer, and he kissed her. This time, it was different. There was no hesitation, no guilt, just raw need. She kissed him back, her hands moving up to his shoulders, pulling him closer, feeling his warmth, the strength in his body. It was everything she had imagined, everything she had needed, and more. She was no longer just the woman who kissed her husband goodnight. She was the woman who kissed Clark with all the hunger she had buried for so long. Clark's hands moved down her back, pulling her into him with a force that matched her own desperation. She could feel his heartbeat against her chest, fast and unsteady. His lips left hers, trailing down her neck, and she gasped, her fingers digging into his shirt. "I want you," he muttered against her skin, his hands sliding under the fabric of her dress. The words hit her like a jolt of electricity, and she couldn't hold back any longer. She let out a quiet moan as his fingers traced the curve of her waist, and then the side of her dress, tugging it upward. The fabric of her dress was suddenly too tight, too confining. She didn't want it. She didn't need it. She needed him. His hands were on her, exploring, undoing all the barriers she had built around herself. She let him. She let him strip away the walls, the defenses, until there was nothing left but desire. And then, finally, they were together. The hours that followed were a blur of skin, heat, and breathless moments. The world outside Clark's apartment faded into nothing. There was only them. Only the chaos of what was happening. Only the pleasure of being touched, of being seen in a way she hadn't been in so long. And for a moment, just a moment, Hannah let herself forget everything else. Her marriage, her doubts, her guilt. There was only Clark. When it was over, when the weight of the moment finally settled, she lay beside him, breathless, her body still trembling. She stared up at the ceiling, her mind racing. What had she done? But the question didn't linger. Not right now. Not in the aftermath of what had just happened. All she could think of was the way he had touched her. The way he had made her feel like she was something more than just a wife. More than just a woman who had forgotten what it was like to be desired. She wasn't sure what this was, what any of it meant. But she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't stop now. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting pale stripes across the room. Hannah awoke slowly. The remnants of a night she couldn't quite recall clearly clinging to her thoughts. Her body ached in a way that both felt foreign and completely familiar. Clark's scent still lingered on her skin, in her hair. She could almost taste him. A trace of something forbidden on her lips. She sat up, the blanket sliding off her body. Her mind raced back to the previous night, to the rush of desire, to the way she had let go of everything. It hadn't been just physical. It hadn't been just a fleeting moment of weakness. It had been more deeper, sharper, more intimate than anything she had ever felt. But as the haze of sleep lifted, so did the weight of guilt. She ran a hand through her tangled hair and stood, moving slowly as she tried to steady her thoughts. She glanced at the clock. It was late. Daniel would be home soon. She hadn't even texted him. She had left the house without a word. Shame crept in. But it was overshadowed by a knot of tension in her stomach. This wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about everything. The life she had built, the choices she had made, and the person she was becoming. The apartment felt colder when she stepped into the living room, as if the walls had absorbed the weight of her actions. She had taken a shower before leaving, scrubbing away every trace of Clark. But it didn't matter. His presence was still here, lingering in the air like smoke. She walked into the kitchen, still barefoot, and began making coffee. The routine helped ground her, but the pounding in her chest refused to subside. She couldn't keep pretending it didn't matter. It mattered. The buzzing of her phone broke her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was Daniel. "I'm home. Can we talk?" Her stomach twisted. She knew what this meant. She had been avoiding it. But now, the reckoning had arrived. Daniel's footsteps echoed in the hallway as he walked toward the kitchen. Hannah turned, her heart pounding. She tried to steady her breath, but it came out uneven, sharp. "Hey," Daniel said softly as he entered the room. His eyes were heavy, his face unreadable. He looked tired. He had been working late for the past few nights, as he often did. But there was something different about him today. Something that felt broken. "Hi," she replied. Her voice too small, too quiet. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "Where were you last night?" Hannah's heart skipped a beat. I went for a drive, she lied. Needed some space. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed his bag on the counter and crossed the room to her. He stood there, his back to her, staring out the window. "You're lying to me," he said finally, his voice tight. "I can see it in your eyes. I can feel it in the way you've been acting." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been trying to convince herself that everything could go back to normal, that she could slip back into the life she once had. But Daniel's words shattered that illusion. "I don't know what you mean," she said, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. He turned to face her then, his gaze sharp. "I know when something's wrong with you. I know when you're pulling away, and I don't know how to fix it anymore." Hannah's chest tightened. "Daniel, You've been distant for weeks, Hannah," he interrupted. "You're not the woman I married anymore." The pain in his voice was something she hadn't expected. He was angry, yes, but there was also something else there. Hurt. Confusion. She had never seen him like this. They had their problems, sure. But this was different. "I don't want to fight with you," he said, his voice softer now. "But I can't keep pretending everything's fine when I know it's not." Hannah's breath caught. She wanted to explain, to tell him everything. She wanted to confess, to relieve the weight on her chest. But the words wouldn't come. She was terrified of the consequences, of the anger, of losing him. "Daniel?" she whispered. But her voice cracked. She felt tears prickle at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not now, not when she didn't know what she was feeling. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out, but he stopped himself just before touching her. "Tell me what's going on, Hannah," he said, his voice pleading. For a moment she stood there, frozen, the world spinning around her. She could feel the tension between them, the unspoken truth, the affair, the betrayal. But she couldn't find the strength to admit it. Not yet. "I'm sorry," was all she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel took a step back, his face pale. He shook his head, and for a moment, she thought he might leave. Leave her in the silence and the mess she had made. But instead, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, heading toward the bedroom. She stood there, her legs trembling, unable to follow him. She felt like she was sinking, drowning in the weight of her own choices. That evening, after a long, silent dinner, Daniel retreated to the bedroom. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. The distance between them had grown so vast, it felt like there was no coming back from it. The space in their marriage, the distance in their touch, had become too much to ignore, too much to fix. Hannah couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind raced, replaying the events of the last few weeks, the kiss, the affair, the guilt. She knew the truth now. She had chosen this path. She had crossed a line and she couldn't erase it. Her phone buzzed again. It was Clark. "I miss you. When can I see you again?" She stared at the message, her heart pounding, a strange mix of desire and guilt twisting in her chest. She knew she couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep pretending. She had to make a choice, and she had no idea what that choice would be.